If you want to understand what actually protects a family in a real economic breakdown, stop watching people talk about gold prices. Start watching what people trade when money stops working. Because here's the uncomfortable truth most Americans never hear. Gold doesn't fail during collapse because it loses value. It fails because it doesn't solve today's problem. In the United States, we're taught that wealth equals safety, savings accounts, portfolios, precious metals locked in a safe. That logic works, right up until the moment systems stop functioning normally. And when that moment arrives, history shows something strange happens. People don't ask, "What's this worth later?" They ask, "What keeps my family alive tonight?" Food, water, heat, medicine, skills, trust. That shift happens faster than anyone expects. Not over decades, not over generations, sometimes in months, sometimes in weeks. What's even more unsettling is this. Many of the people who prepared correctly by financial standards still lost everything. And many who looked unprepared on paper survived just fine. If you've ever wondered why smart, responsible people get blindsided in crises, while others quietly adapt and endure, this is where the misunderstanding begins. Don't jump to conclusions yet, just stay with me, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Most Americans are taught to analyze risk through a financial lens. Markets up, markets down, inflation numbers, interest rates, asset allocation. That lens isn't wrong, it's just incomplete. Mainstream media treats economic stress like weather, temporary, cyclical, something the Federal Reserve, Congress, or a new election will eventually fix. The assumption baked into almost every headline is that the system itself remains intact. But history shows that the most dangerous moments aren't recessions or bear markets. They're system transitions, when the rules quietly change. When people say, "This time is different," they're usually wrong. But when people say, "This can't happen here," they're almost always wrong. The mistake isn't underestimating volatility. The mistake is misunderstanding what actually breaks first. It's rarely banks collapsing overnight. It's rarely total chaos on day one. What usually fails first is functionality. Money still exists, but doesn't buy much. Stores are open, but shelves are thin. Jobs exist, but wages lag reality. Institutions operate, but trust erodes. In that gray zone, traditional financial thinking loses precision. Liquidity doesn't mean access. Net worth doesn't mean resilience. And wealth becomes strangely disconnected from survival. This is where most analysis stops, because this zone is uncomfortable. It doesn't fit clean charts or quarterly earnings calls. But this is the zone where real outcomes are decided. If you only prepare for market downturns, you're preparing for volatility inside the system. What history keeps warning us about is stress on the system itself. To understand that difference, we need to stop speculating and start examining documented collapses step by step. That's where the real data lives. When economic systems fail, they leave behind patterns, not opinions, not theories, patterns. One of the clearest modern case studies comes from the siege of Sarajevo in the early 1990s. Over a period of months, a functioning European city lost electricity, running water, organized food distribution, and reliable currency. This wasn't ancient history. It happened in a modern urban environment. Multiple first-hand accounts document how quickly money stopped working. In the early phase, people still attempted to use cash. Within weeks, prices began multiplying by factors of 20, 30, even 100. A pack of cigarettes that cost the equivalent of $1 outside the siege traded for dozens of dollars worth of currency inside. Eventually, money was abandoned altogether in favor of direct exchange. We see the same pattern decades later in Venezuela. Between 2016 and 2019, official inflation exceeded 1,000,000%. The national currency lost so much purchasing power that wages could no longer buy basic food. In response, the government removed high-denomination bills from circulation. Argentina's collapse from 1998 to 2002 followed a similar trajectory. GDP contracted roughly 28%. Bank withdrawals were frozen. These aren't isolated cases. They form a repeatable timeline. First, currency devalues rapidly. Second, pricing becomes unstable. Third, trust in money erodes. Fourth, economies revert to barter. During Venezuela's collapse, fishermen along the coast traded fish directly for rice, plantains, and flour. Hardware stores accepted coffee beans as payment. Coffee became money because it was standardized, consumable, and immediately useful. Historical data from the United States tells a parallel story. During the Great Depression, unemployment reached roughly 25%. World War II reinforced the same lesson. By 1943, over 20 million American households planted victory gardens. Across countries, cultures, and decades, the facts align. When money fails, utility replaces valuation. What you can use, produce, fix, or trade matters more than what you own on paper. That's not philosophy. That's documented behavior. Taken together, these events suggest something deeper than poor policy or bad leadership. They point to a structural dynamic that repeats when complex systems are stressed beyond a certain threshold. One possible explanation is that modern economies are optimized for efficiency, not resilience. Under normal conditions, that works extremely well. Goods move quickly. Capital flows freely. Specialization increases productivity. But efficiency comes with a trade-off: fragility. When stress enters the system, whether from war, debt overload, inflation, or supply chain disruption, the most optimized components fail first. Currency, for example, depends entirely on trust and coordination. Once confidence erodes, money doesn't gradually weaken, it snaps. This suggests that collapse is not a single event, but a phase shift. The economy doesn't slowly slide downward. It changes state. In the early phase, financial assets still appear functional. Markets may even rally. But beneath the surface, incentives distort. Governments prioritize liquidity over stability. Central banks expand balance sheets. Emergency measures become permanent. Who benefits during this phase? Institutions with proximity to money creation, entities that can reprice quickly, organizations with political access. Who loses? Wage earners, fixed-income households, savers, anyone whose economic power depends on stability rather than adaptability. As stress increases, systems respond by narrowing options. Capital controls, withdrawal limits, rationing, informal restrictions that later become formal policy. These measures are not evidence of control, they're evidence of strain. At this stage, value begins migrating away from abstractions and toward function. Not because people suddenly reject money, but because money stops coordinating reality effectively. One way to think about this is through power flow. Power moves toward whatever solves immediate problems: food production, energy access, security, repair, medical capability. These nodes gain leverage because they reduce dependence on failing systems. This may explain why productive land consistently outperforms financial assets during prolonged stress, and why practical skills retain value across regimes. They operate outside centralized coordination. It also helps explain why gold behaves paradoxically. Strategically, gold performs best in transitions between systems, not inside the breakdown itself. It stores optionality for a future order, but offers little leverage during the disorder phase. This interpretation doesn't argue that collapse is inevitable. It argues that when systems are stressed, adaptability outperforms ownership. And that insight reframes how risk should be understood, not as market volatility, but as functional dependence. When systems enter this kind of stress phase, the consequences ripple far beyond markets. What begins as an economic problem gradually reshapes institutions, governance, and global power relationships. Markets, first, lose their signaling function. Prices stop reflecting supply and demand and start reflecting fear, access, and intervention. Volatility increases, not because assets are inherently unstable, but because information becomes unreliable. When pricing breaks, planning breaks with it. Banks respond defensively, credit tightens, lending standards rise just as people need flexibility most. In extreme cases, access to deposits is restricted, not always through overt freezes, but through daily limits, delays, or temporary controls that quietly become permanent. Confidence erodes further, accelerating the cycle. Currencies follow a familiar path. As governments attempt to stabilize conditions, They expand monetary supply, introduce controls, or redefine legal tender. These actions may slow panic, but they often weaken long-term credibility. Citizens adapt rationally by minimizing exposure to instruments they don't control. Governments face narrowing options. As fiscal pressure increases, policy choices become reactive rather than strategic. Resources are directed toward maintaining order and funding obligations, often at the expense of long-term investment. Political polarization intensifies as scarcity forces trade-offs that were previously hidden. At the global level, stress fractures cooperation. Trade relationships become transactional. Alliances strain as nations prioritize internal stability. Supply chains regionalize. Strategic resources, energy, food, industrial inputs, become leverage points rather than commodities. This environment doesn't necessarily produce collapse everywhere at once. More often, it produces asymmetry. Some regions stabilize, others degrade. The world becomes uneven, not uniformly broken. For individuals and families, this means outcomes diverge sharply. Those embedded in flexible networks with access to local production and multiple forms of value exchange adapt. Those dependent on centralized systems experience compounding friction. The critical insight is this: systemic stress doesn't eliminate order. It reorders power. Influence shifts away from abstractions and toward function, away from scale and toward proximity, away from promises and toward capability. Understanding that shift isn't about fear, it's about positioning. Because once systems reconfigure, the people who anticipated the direction, not the timing, are the ones who retain agency. All of this can sound abstract until it touches daily life. But systemic stress doesn't announce itself with headlines. It shows up quietly in ordinary decisions. It shows up when savings don't stretch as far as they used to, even though your balance looks the same. When prices change faster than paychecks. When services that once felt automatic become unreliable or delayed. For households, the first impact is usually purchasing power. Inflation doesn't just raise prices, it compresses choices. Families stop optimizing for value and start optimizing for availability. What matters isn't what's cheapest, but what's accessible when you need it. Employment follows. Jobs tied to discretionary spending or centralized systems become less stable. Meanwhile, work connected to essentials, food, repairs, logistics, healthcare, tends to persist. Not because it pays more, but because demand doesn't disappear. Investments behave differently than expected. Assets designed to preserve value over long horizons may fluctuate wildly in the short term. Liquidity becomes situational. Something can be valuable and still unusable at the moment it's needed. Cost of living pressures compound. Housing, energy, insurance, and food absorb a larger share of income. Families feel squeezed even without dramatic income loss. Stress accumulates not from a single shock, but from constant friction. The most significant effect, though, is psychological. Uncertainty alters behavior. People delay decisions. Hoard resources, reduce trust. Communities either fragment or quietly reorganize. This is where preparation diverges from panic. Preparation isn't about predicting collapse. It's about reducing dependence on fragile systems before they fail. The families who navigate these periods best aren't necessarily the wealthiest. They're the ones with optionality. Multiple ways to earn, multiple ways to access essentials, multiple relationships that don't rely on formal intermediaries. When macro forces translate into personal life, resilience shows up as calm, not because conditions are easy, but because dependence has been reduced. That's the difference between reacting and adapting. To make sense of all this without drifting into fear or speculation, it helps to use a consistent way of thinking. This is the framework I rely on when analyzing economic stress. I call it survival capital. Survival capital isn't about wealth in the traditional sense. It's about what continues to work when systems don't. The framework has 5 layers, and they're intentionally ordered. Layer 1 is functionality. Can you access water, food, heat, light, and basic medical care without relying entirely on centralized systems? Layer 2 is production. Can you create something others need? Grow food, fix equipment, preserve resources? Production turns consumption into leverage. Layer 3 is skills. Skills travel with you. They can't be frozen, devalued, or confiscated easily. The more fundamental the skill, the longer its relevance lasts. Layer 4 is community. Trust is infrastructure. In stressed systems, informal networks often outperform formal institutions. People trade with those they know before they trade with strangers. Layer 5 is optionality. This is where financial assets and precious metals belong. They matter most after stabilization, not during disruption. Optionality preserves future flexibility, but only if the earlier layers are secure. The mistake most people make is starting at layer 5 and working backward. That works in stable systems. It fails in transitional ones. Survival capital flips the sequence. It prioritizes resilience before returns, capability before valuation. This framework doesn't tell you what to buy or when to act. It gives you a lens, a way to filter noise from signal. Once you adopt it, economic headlines start to read differently. You stop asking, "What's the market doing?" and start asking, "What still functions if this breaks?" That shift alone is a form of protection. Applying the survival capital framework doesn't require radical changes or dramatic bets. It's about orientation, how you think, observe, and quietly reduce risk over time. Start by auditing dependence. Ask where your household relies on single points of failure: water, power, transportation, income, healthcare access. The goal isn't independence from society, but less fragility inside it. Next, prioritize redundancy over optimization. Efficient systems break cleanly, resilient systems degrade slowly. Having multiple ways to cook, heat, communicate, or earn income matters more than having the best option. Skill development is one of the highest return investments available. Basic food production, preservation, repair, and first aid skills compound quietly. They don't show up on balance sheets, but they surface immediately when conditions tighten. Observe what people actually need, not what commentators discuss. During stress, demand concentrates around essentials: food, maintenance, care, energy. Those signals appear locally long before they register nationally. Strengthen community ties intentionally, not through formal prepping groups, but through ordinary relationships. Neighbors, local tradespeople, churches, civic organizations. Trust built in calm periods pays dividends under pressure. When it comes to assets, think in layers. Financial instruments and precious metals can still play a role, but as optionality, not foundations. They preserve flexibility for recovery phases, not resilience during disruption. Avoid urgency. Systems usually degrade unevenly. Acting from panic often increases exposure rather than reducing it. The most effective preparation is incremental, boring, and consistent. Finally, remember that resilience isn't about expecting the worst. It's about being less surprised when conditions change. The goal isn't to predict collapse. It's to function through uncertainty. People who focus on that distinction tend to make better decisions, regardless of what the macro environment does next. If there's one takeaway to carry forward, it's this: stability isn't binary. Systems don't flip from working to broken overnight. They drift, they strain, they adapt unevenly. History doesn't reward those who panic, and it doesn't reward those who ignore signals either. It tends to favor people who quietly reposition while others debate narratives. This isn't a call to abandon modern life or reject markets. It's an invitation to see beyond them, to recognize that beneath every financial system is something more basic: people solving problems for one another. When money coordinates that process, life feels smooth. When it doesn't, capability steps in. Awareness changes how you interpret the world. Headlines become context instead of triggers. Volatility becomes information instead of fear. Preparation becomes a mindset rather than a reaction. Nothing here requires certainty about the future. It only requires honesty about dependency. Once you understand that, your focus naturally shifts. From chasing returns to building resilience, from predicting outcomes to preserving agency. And that's a position that holds value in any environment.